Hello everyone, and welcome back to Aliens After Dark. Every night on this channel, I share alien and UFO encounter stories, told softly to help you unwind and drift off to sleep. Before we begin, I'd love to hear from you. Leave a comment and let me know where you're listening from tonight. Now, get comfortable, let your eyes close if they want to, and let's begin. Every surface in that mountain went to running water in about a minute, and it would not touch me. My name is Maxine. In 1979, I was a utilities mechanic inside the mountain southwest of Colorado Springs, 33 years old, on the graveyard round, and I want to say at the front that I am not telling you anything about what that place did. I never knew much of it, and what I knew was boring. I am telling you about water on a floor. Here is the part people get wrong when they picture it. They picture a control room. What I worked in was the rock. They dug a hole in a mountain, and then they built buildings inside the hole, steel buildings, and they set those buildings on springs so that the mountain could move and the buildings could sit still about it. And in between the buildings and the granite there is a gap. That gap is where I lived. 11 feet of it in most places, less at the north end, and my whole job was the water in it. Because a mountain sweats. That is all a mountain does if you leave it alone. Water comes down through granite the way it has always come down through granite, and it does not care what you built underneath. So there were drip pans hung everywhere, and a condensate return, and a sump, and chilled water going one way, and warm water coming back, and me on a round at 2 a.m. with a slate and a piece of chalk. I kept what we called the sweat log, dew point, wet bulb, and the level in 3 drip pans, chalked on a slate hung off the chilled water riser at the head of the chamber. And I checked 2 of the spring cans with a feeler gauge, because a building that settles is a building somebody wants to hear about before it settles any further. That is it. That is the whole job I did for 9 years. It is probably the least interesting work anybody did in that state, and I was very good at it. The feeler gauge hung off my belt on a piece of string, and when you dropped it, which you did, it swung in and hit the side of a spring can and made a note like somebody tapping a wine glass in another room. I could tell you the 4 kinds of drip in that chamber. The pan by the riser was a slow one with a deep sound because it fell about 11 inches into standing water. The one at the second building had a tinny fast sound because somebody had hung it crooked in 1971, and nobody had ever straightened it. There was one behind the north stair that you could not hear at all unless you stood still, and one at the far end that was really 2 drips out of phase, and if you listened long enough they would come together and then walk apart again. That is what I had instead of a radio. My father was a well man in Nebraska, and he had one thing he said about all of it, which is that water goes where it is going and your opinion is not in it. He meant it as a comfort. I took it as a comfort for about 33 years. 2 things about that round. The first is that it was one person. Not because it was dangerous, but because 2 people would have been a waste of a body, and the Air Force did not waste bodies on drip pans. The second is that the radio did not work between the buildings. Never had. Everybody knew it was in a maintenance file somewhere with a date on it from before I was hired, and nobody ever fixed it, because nobody ever needed it fixed. So if something happened to me at the north end, the men on the far side of the buildings would find out about it at 7 when I did not turn up. You get used to the place faster than you would think. There are 2 things you never get used to. One is the doors, which you feel in your sternum a half second before you hear them, and which I have never been able to describe to anybody who has not stood near them. The other is that when the diesels have been running, the air gets a taste in it like a penny under your tongue, and it takes about 2 hours to go away, and you find yourself swallowing for no reason. And the springs. I forget that people do not know about the springs. Those buildings are sitting on great steel cans, hundreds of them, and the whole world in there has a half-inch of give in it. You do not notice until you drop something and it lands wrong. Then you notice for about a week. I want to be plain about myself. I am not a person things happen to. I had done that round twice a week for 2 winters, and the most interesting thing that ever occurred was a rat, once, which had come in on a pallet and was very confused. I did not believe in anything. I still mostly do not. What I have is a night, and I've gone over it for 40-some years the way you go over a bill you think is wrong. It was March. Inside, March means nothing, which is another thing people do not understand about that place. There is no weather in there. It is 50-some degrees and wet forever. The sodium lights on the crown of the chamber made everything the color of weak tea. It smelled like rock and diesel and a little chlorine. And it was loud, always, in the way a plant is loud, which is not loud enough to bother you, but loud enough that you never hear anything small. I had chalked my numbers at the riser at about 2:15, and I was walking the gap toward the north end, where it narrows, because I was the only one on the crew who fit in there comfortably, and everybody knew that too. And I had my light in my hand, an old rubber one with a switch I had been meaning to replace for 2 years. The drip stopped. Not the machinery. The machinery kept doing everything it always did. The drip. Every pan I could hear, and I could hear 4 of them from where I stood and could have named each by its note, went quiet inside about 4 seconds. And under that, the sump note dropped out. And what was left was one sound of water in the whole excavation, and it was the one I was standing in the middle of, which was nothing, because I was standing in the middle of nothing. I remember thinking that a pump had gone and that I was about to have a bad hour with a work order. That is honestly what I thought. That is what you think. I turned around to walk back to the riser, and there was a line on the floor. It was a wet edge. Dark concrete on one side, light concrete on the other, and it was coming toward me from the far end of the chamber at about the speed a person walks. Not fast, not dramatic, just coming. The way the tide comes at you on a flat beach when you have been reading and you look up. That floor does not slope. I know because it was my job to know. And there was nothing above it to be dripping, and there was no source I could see behind it, and the edge was even the whole width of the gap, going over the concrete and up over the rail and over the base of the spring can, without any hesitation at the corners, the way water does hesitate at a corner. It went over the corner like paint. I stood still. That was probably stupid. I stood still because I had already decided a line had let go somewhere upstream, and I wanted to see how much of the floor it was going to take so I could tell them a number. It reached my boots and it opened. I want to be careful here because this is the part that I have said out loud maybe 6 times in my life. It did not stop. It did not pile up against my boots the way water does when it hits something. It opened about 1/4 of an inch out from the leather, all the way around both feet, and went past me on both sides, and closed up again behind my heels, and kept going toward the riser at the same walking pace it had come. And then the whole chamber was wet. Everything. The rock face was running. The steel was running. The sides of the buildings had sheets of water on them coming down like a window in a storm. And I was standing in a dry patch shaped like a person, and it was the only dry thing in about 400 feet. Here is the thing that I could not get anybody to care about afterwards, and it is the thing that still gets me. There was no fog. When air goes to condensation on every surface in a space that size, you should not be able to see your own hand. I could read my slate at 40 feet. The air was clear as a bell, and nothing was dripping from anything. Nothing fell. The water was just on things, all at once, the way frost is on things in the morning without you ever having seen frost arrive. I got a good look at the edge, and the edge is the only thing in this whole story I actually saw, so I will give it to you the way I would give it to an inspector. It had no thickness. It was not a meniscus, and it did not bead, and it did not stand up the way water stands up against a boot. It was simply where the wet stopped, a quarter of an inch out from me, holding that quarter inch around the toe and the arch and the heel, around a shape as complicated as a boot, without one place where it got the distance wrong. I put my hand out. I do not know why. I put my bare left palm flat on a plate on the side of the near building, which was streaming, and I held it there for what I would guess was 3 or 4 seconds, and I took it away, and my hand was dry, and the water closed over the shape of my hand and went on running. I looked at my palm for a long time. It was dry, the way a hand is dry. Not cold, not warm, just my hand, in a room where everything else was wet. I decided to go up the ladder to the crown, which was the nearest thing I had to a plan. It is a chain-hung ladder, and I've gone up it 1,000 times. I took 11 steps toward it, and I counted them, because by then something in me had started counting, and the dry came with me. Every step. It opened in front of me and closed behind my heel, and the floor I had been standing on a second before was as wet as everything else. Then it stopped. The water ran off under the far buildings toward the sump, and one by one, from the far end back toward me, the pans started ticking again. And I stood there for about 4 minutes, and I got all the way to a perfectly good explanation. A chilled water line had let go upstream, the pans had been briefly starved because of a pressure thing, and the reason it went around my boots was that my boots were displacing it, obviously, and I was going to right it up, and somebody was going to fix a pipe. I was a little pleased with myself, that is the truth. I stood in a mountain in the middle of the night feeling clever. Then I looked down, and my coveralls were soaked from the shoulders to the cuffs, heavy with it, and stiffening already in that cold, and my hands were dry, and my face was dry, and my hair was dry. I did not go up the ladder. I finished my round because I was 33, and I was the only woman on that crew, and I was not going to be the one who left. And I chalked my 4 o'clock numbers on the slate, and at 7 I clocked out and drove home, and sat in my car in my own driveway for about half an hour. I did write it up. I wrote it up the way you write things up when you would like to keep your job, which is that I reported a loss of drip in 4 pans, a general wetting of the chamber, and standing water on the floor at the north end, and I put a question mark next to the chilled water riser. Arliss was the shift lead, and he was a decent man, and he read it and said he would have Dorsey look at the riser. Dorsey looked at the riser for 2 days, and the riser was fine. Everything was fine. There is no pipe in that mountain that let go that night, and there is no record that one did. And I have had 40 years to make my peace with that, and I have not entirely. Arliss asked me once, about a week after, in the way men ask a thing they have decided not to ask properly, whether I had been feeling all right on that round. I said I had. He said good. That was the whole conversation, and I've always been grateful for it, because the version of that conversation where he pushed would have gone somewhere neither of us wanted. They did find things. And this is the part I would ask you to sit with for a second before you go to sleep. The reservoir level for that shift was up. More than the pumps had run, by roughly what the walls had been carrying if you did the arithmetic, which somebody did and then wrote a different number down, and the outline was still there 2 days later. In a chamber, sitting at 100% humidity, on a floor that never dries because it cannot dry, there was a patch of concrete shaped like a person, dry to the hand. They laid a rag on it overnight to see. The rag was dry in the morning. I know that because I laid it there. And on the slate under my 4 o'clock numbers, there was a second set of numbers in my own chalk and in my own handwriting, taken at a time when I know exactly where I was, which was on that floor, counting steps. I have thought about that one more than the rest of it. Not because it frightens me, because those numbers were right. Whoever wrote them had read that chamber correctly to 1/10 of a degree, and they had done it in my hand, and they had not gotten one thing wrong. Nobody chased me. Nothing came near me. Nothing wanted anything from me at all, as far as I can tell, and I have had a long time to tell. Something went through that mountain and got water onto every square inch of 400 feet of it and left a person out, on purpose, exactly, continuously, at 1/4 of an inch while she walked. To leave somebody out that, carefully, you have to know where they end, the whole time. That is what I think about. I worked in there another 9 years and nothing ever happened again, and I liked the job and I retired out of it and I have a good pension. But I still put a bare palm flat on cold steel before I will trust a room. My husband used to ask what I was doing and I would say, checking, and he would let it go, which is one of about 11 reasons I married him. I put my hand on it and I take it away, and I look at my hand. Maybe I just misread a bad night with a pump on it 40-some years ago and turned it into something, but then again, maybe not. 30 mules turned and looked at the same piece of sky, and the one under my hand would not. Lonnie Fetters. I was 24. I packed for the Army out of the high camp in the Eagle River Valley, and in October of 1958, I had 31 head on a highline on a bench about an hour above the valley floor. 2 dogs, a wall tent, a lantern, and me. That is the whole cast. People hear Army and picture something. Do not picture anything. I fed animals, and I shot animals, and I tied loads onto animals, and I walked in front of them, and the entire United States military use of me was that if you have to put a mortar somewhere a truck cannot go, somebody has to know how to do that. And by 1958, there were not many of us left who did. The bench was our summer ground, and we were finishing on it. There's a mile of good grass up there and a creek, and the valley below fills with fog most nights in October, and just sits there under the camp lights like something poured. From up on the bench, you can look down on a whole town of light with cloud on it. I have not seen anything better since, and I have looked. I want to tell you 2 dull things before I tell you the rest, because they matter. The first is the high line. You run a line between 2 trees, high, and you tie your animals off it on short leads with a knot that will not slip and will not tighten, and you space them so they cannot get a leg over one another in the night. 31 head takes a while, and the reason you do it that way, instead of hobbling them, is that a mule can walk 11 miles in the dark on hobbles and be very pleased about it in the morning. The second is a habit, and it is mine, and it is old. Before any climb, I lay my forearm flat across the withers of the lead animal and stand there for a count of about 20. You can feel the breathing through the shoulder. You can feel whether a mule is tight in front, whether he slept, whether he is sore somewhere he has not shown you yet. My grandfather did it, and I do it because he did it. It is not scientific, and I would not defend it. It just works. There is no line up to that bench, and there never was. The telephone is in the valley, and the valley was under fog. So it was me, and 31 head and 2 dogs, and I've always thought of that as good company and better odds, and I still do, mostly. I have slept out with stock since I was 11 years old. I want that on the record. I know what a string does about a bear, which is a great deal of noise and a great deal of trying to leave. I know what they do about a lion, which is worse. I know what they do about weather coming, and about a man walking wrong in the dark, and about a strange dog. I have a list in my head of every reason a string comes up at night, and I could recite it for you. And what happened that night is not on it. It was cold and clear, and the first real frost of the year was going down. You can hear frost go down if it is quiet enough and if it is going down fast. It is a sound like somebody straightening tissue paper in the next room. The stars up there in October are close enough to be rude about it. I had the lantern hung in the tent fly making its ring on the canvas, and I was outside of it, standing at the head of the line with my arm across my lead mule, because I was going to move them at first light, and I wanted to know how he had spent his evening. The dogs stood up, both of them at the same instant, from lying down to standing, which they do not do together unless somebody has thrown something. And they faced the same way, out over the valley, and they did not bark. That is the first wrong thing. They did not bark, and they did not growl, and they did not put their hackles up. Tuck was a serious dog who barked at aeroplanes and at the idea of aeroplanes, and he stood there like a man at a bus stop. Then the string came up. 30 animals stood and turned, and faced the same bearing. There was no plunging, nobody swung on the line, nobody pulled back, nobody made one sound. If you have been around picketed stock, you will know how strange that sentence is. 30 mules standing up at once is a noise. This was not a noise. It was more like a crowd turning to watch somebody come into a room, and the one under my hand did not turn. He stood there with his head down at the grass and his ears loose and one back foot cocked, which is a mule saying he has no plans. I took his halter and swung his head around to the bearing, because I wanted him to see whatever it was so I could see what he thought about it, and he came around willingly enough, and then he brought his head back. Gentle, no fight in it, like a man putting his hand over the top of a glass. I did it again, and he did it again, and after that I stopped, because I am not a person who argues with an animal that is being polite. I followed the bearing myself. I have thought about this more than any other part. There was nothing to look at. There was sky over the valley, and there was the fog under it lit orange from the camp, and there was no light, no shape, no sound, no smell, no motion at all. And 30 animals looked steadily at it for what I would put at 11 minutes. An animal does not look at nothing for 11 minutes. A horse will stare at a plastic bag for 10 seconds and then get bored and eat. 30 of them, holding a bearing, no heads dropping, no ears flicking off it. I stood in the middle of my own string in the dark, and I was not frightened yet, and I want to be honest that I was not, because what I mostly was insulted. Something was going on, and my animal and I had not been invited. Then I noticed the frost. Every coat on that line was standing up with frost in it. You could see it in the starlight, silver along the barrel and the neck, the hair lifted, and each hair with its own weight of white on it. 30 animals gone gray while I was watching the sky, and the coat under my forearm was flat, and it was warm. I lifted my arm off him. The strip stayed, a band across the withers about as wide as my forearm, dark and lying flat and warm, in an animal that was silvered to the eyes everywhere else, including 6 inches further along where my hand had been resting on his neck, which was frosted like the rest of him. So it was not the animal, and it was not the heat of me, because my hand had been on his neck the whole time too, and his neck was white. I did the only test I could think of, which is that I let go of the halter and I stepped back 6 feet. He turned his head and came with me. Not toward the bearing, toward me. He put his head around to keep his eye on me, and his body stayed where it was, and he did not once look at what the other 30 were looking at, and I understood, standing there in the frost, that he was not ignoring it. He was being kept off it, and so was I. And the only difference between him and the other 30 was that he was the one I had my hand on. Then they put their heads down, all of them at once, and started pulling grass like nothing. The dogs turned around 3 times each and lay back down and sighed the way dogs do. And I stood there in the cold telling myself it was elk on the ridge, and I simply could not see them for the dark. And honestly, for about 5 minutes I nearly got there. Elk make a string uneasy. It happens. except that a string uneasy about elk is a string that keeps checking. This one went straight back to grass and never looked at that piece of sky again for the rest of the night, and neither did anything else. Whatever it was over, and everybody but me seemed to know that. I did not sleep much. I sat in the tent fly with the lantern low and listened to 31 animals breathe, which is a sound like slow surf. And I watched the fog in the valley go from orange to gray to nothing. In the morning, the valley said it had been a clear, quiet night. Hobart rode up for the string at about 7, and his own animal walked the length of that bench without looking at anything at all. And Hobart looked at me for a second and asked if I had slept, and I said not much, and he said, "The altitude does that," and we packed up. The band on the withers was still there. Still flat, still warm to the back of my hand hours later, in an animal standing in frost, with the frost gone down over every other inch of him. Exactly as wide as my forearm, exactly where my forearm had been. I put my arm back on it to check that it matched, and it matched, and I took my arm off, and I have not put my arm across a set of withers since. He was fine. That is the thing I want to say, because I have told this a few times and people wait for the animal to be ruined. He was not ruined. He was the best mule I ever had, and I had him 19 more years, and he died old on a place I owned outside of Salida with his feet in good grass. The dogs would not go past a certain point at the north end of that bench for the rest of the week, and then they would, and that was that. There were no tracks. Mine and the animals and the dogs and nothing else. In ground that was taking a print an inch deep in the frost by morning. Nothing came up there. Nothing went down. I am 70 years past 24 now, and I have not got a theory. I do not think anything wanted anything from me. I do not think I was in danger for 1 second, and I have never once felt that I was. 30 animals were shown something and 2 of us were not, and the 2 of us were the 2 that were touching. To hold a thing off a man and off whatever the man has his hand on, and to move the line when he moves his hand, and to put it back down again the second he lets go, you have to be watching very closely. That is all I have got. Something up there was being extremely careful with me, and I do not know why, and I never will, and I have decided that is all right. I still will not lay an arm across a horse's withers. I will put a hand on a neck all day long. Just not the withers, and not flat, and not for a count of 20. Maybe an old man built that out of a cold night and a warm animal and 11 minutes of nothing. But then again, maybe not. There was a west wind laying 11 miles of grass over, and it was not in my ears. I am Suzette. I was 41, I counted birds for a living, and in January of 1987, I was doing the winter roost survey on the fenced army ground northeast of Denver, in Commerce City, out on the open prairie section where the cottonwoods run along the old ditch. The first thing I would like on the record is the time, because the time is the first column on my sheet, and after 20 years it is the first thing I say about anything. 4:51 in the afternoon, last light. That is when you count a roost before the birds settle, not after, because after, they are in the branches and you are guessing. The second thing is that I do not enjoy being asked how I felt about it. I count things. If the number matters, they call me. I have stood on that ditch in 11 winters of weather, and I have never once written the word strange on a data sheet. Here is the ground so you can see it. Fenced, posted, mostly empty, several thousand acres of short grass with prairie dog towns in it, and the old ditch running through, and along the ditch a line of cottonwoods bare in January, with 40-some birds sitting in them at dusk like bad fruit. Behind all of it, refinery stacks going orange, and behind those, Denver, and behind that the whole front range with the light coming off it. It is one of the more beautiful places I have ever worked, and almost nobody has ever been allowed to see it, which is why the birds are there. The wind. The country gets a west wind coming down off the range in January that you can actually lean on. It comes over the fence and takes the grass and lays it flat in one direction, and it makes a hiss you can hear a mile off. It gets into the truck and rocks it. It puts a cold in your face that is not about temperature at all. Now, the dull part, which is the part that matters. I tie a fresh strip of surveyor's flagging to my truck aerial every morning. Orange, usually. I read the wind off it before every count, because the anemometer is in the truck, and I am not in the truck. And because a bird will tell you more about wind in 1 second than a machine will tell you in a minute. I had a little thing I said to myself for the angles, which my sister taught me, and which I am not going to repeat because it is embarrassing. Straight out is 30 and better. Half up is 15. Hanging is nothing. That afternoon it was straight out and stiff and had been all day. The other tool is a brass tally counter, the kind with a plunger, worn smooth. I count out loud when I am tired, not loudly. Under my breath in twos, and I have done it since graduate school, and it has embarrassed me exactly once, in front of a man from the state who pretended not to notice, which I have always appreciated. I will give you one more thing about that ground, because I think about it every winter. There is no smell out there in January, none. No cattle, no crop, no mud, no water in the ditch, nothing rotting because nothing rots at that temperature. You spend a day in a place with no smell in it, and you come home and your own kitchen is overwhelming. My sister Neva used to say I came back from that site like a person off a boat. And a roost has a sound before it settles. A lot of low grumbling and shifting and the occasional short complaint, and it has a completely different sound if something is underneath it. I know both. I want to be very clear that I heard the first one that afternoon, the ordinary one, the whole time. The section is 4 miles of 2-track from the gate. The truck radio does not work out there. Everybody knows the radio does not work out there. There is a rise and the rise eats it, and that is the end of the conversation. And the protocol has me alone, because 2 people walking a ditch flush a roost, and then you have counted nothing. I was standing about 60 yards off the trees with the clipboard against my chest, and my back mostly to it, doing what you do, which is holding the pages down with one hand and counting with the tally in the other. And I got to about 31 birds. And the sound went over me. I do not know a better way to put it. The wind was still in the grass. I could hear it hissing across the whole section. I could hear it in the cottonwood branches, which in January is a dry rattling sound. I could hear it hitting the truck behind me, that flat drumming on a door panel. All of it was there, and it was not in my ears. There is a specific noise wind makes actually inside your ear when it is on you, a roaring, and it is so constant in that work that you stop knowing it is there. It stopped, and everything else did not. Then the pages lay down. My clipboard pages stopped lifting. My hair, which had been across my face all afternoon and driving me to distraction, went down onto my shoulders and stayed. I let out a breath, and the breath went straight up. Straight up, in a column, on a prairie that was bending 11 miles of grass over sideways in front of me. I put my arm out. About 4 feet from my chest, my sleeve started snapping. I could see the cuff going and feel nothing at the shoulder. I took my hat off and held it out at arm's length, and the wind got it and tried to take it, and I pulled it back in, and it went dead in my hand. Just hung there, like a hat in a closet. I did that a few times. I am not proud of it. Out, snap, in, nothing. Out, snap, in, nothing. Then I walked. 50 yards up the ditch, deliberately, because I wanted to know whether I'd walked into some pocket of dead air that the bank was making. And I was already composing the sentence about local topography in my head. The still came with me. Every step. And behind me, when I looked, The grass I had been standing in came up off the ground and laid over with everything else. I want to say what did not happen, because it is what convinced me. Not one bird did anything unusual. 40, some of them, up in those cottonwoods, all holding into the wind on their branches with their feathers ruffed the way a bird holds into wind. Textbook. Correct. Every single one behaving exactly as a bird behaves in a 30-mile-an-hour wind, which is how I know beyond any argument that the wind was real and that the exception was me. And then one of them came down. A juvenile, dark, 2nd or 3rd year, off the 4th tree. It dropped down the wind the way they do, tilted, using it, and it came in and landed 11 feet from me on the bare ground between the ditch and where I stood, and folded up. And its feathers went flat. Every feather, flat as a photograph. And the grass at its feet stood straight up, and 40 feet behind it the prairie was going over like water. I have counted somewhere north of 9,000 of those birds in my life, and I have never been closer than about 40 yards to one on the ground on purpose. It stood there. I stood there. Neither of us did anything at all for what I would guess was a minute and a half, which is a very long time, and I did not raise the clipboard and I did not write anything down, which is the only professional failure of my career, and I would do it again. Then it went. 2 steps and up, and the instant it crossed out of that 4 feet, everything started at once. Feathers and grass, both, like a switch had been thrown, at a line in open air with nothing in it, and the wind came back and hit me so hard I had to turn my back on it. That was the moment I felt best. That is the honest order of it. I stood there with my collar up and my eyes running, and I was flooded with relief, because obviously I had been standing in the lee of the ditch bank, and obviously I had simply not noticed the geometry, and I walked back to the truck fully satisfied with myself. Then I drove to where I had been standing, and I got out, and I looked at the geometry. The ditch bank there is about 30 inches high, and it runs the wrong way. There is nothing else. No brush, no berm, no equipment, no fence. I stood in the exact spot with the wind taking my hat, and I could not reproduce 1 second of it. And I tried for 20 minutes in the dark, like a fool with the truck lights on. The gate guard asked me on the way out whether it had blown me around some, and I said yes. Baumgartner. He said it the way he said it every night that winter, and I gave him the answer he wanted. And I drove out through the rut that eats oil pans, and I did not tell one living soul for 6 years. My ex-husband had one opinion about my work, which he delivered once, at a dinner, memorably, and it was that I had found the only job in America where a person could be alone all day and get paid for it. He meant it unkindly. He was right, and I have never held the accuracy against him. 6 years, and then I told Neva, and she asked me the only good question anybody has asked me about it, which was whether the bird had come down to look at me or to get out of the wind. I have never been able to answer her. I do not think it matters, and I think about it constantly. The ribbon is the part I kept. That strip of orange flagging on my truck aerial was straight out when I got to the gate. It was straight out when I got home. It was straight out at 7 the next morning in my own driveway in Aurora, frozen that way, pointing at nothing, on a morning where the wind had been down since 3, and the whole street was still. I untied it and brought it inside, and it thawed in my hand in about a minute and hung down like ribbon, and I put it in a coffee can, and it never did anything again. It is in the same can. It is 39 years old, and it is still orange. Nobody hurt me. Nothing came near me except a bird that had every right to be there and behaved better than I did. Nothing wanted a thing from me. I have gone at it from every direction I have, and the only sentence I can build that holds all the pieces is that a wind came across several thousand acres that afternoon and went around one person and stayed around her while she moved, and let a bird walk into it, and then let the bird back out. To hold a shape like that in moving air for a quarter of an hour while the shape walks 50 yards, you would have to be paying an enormous amount of attention to one woman with a clipboard. That is the part I would like somebody to explain to me, and nobody ever has. I still work. I am too old for it, and I do it anyway, and I still read the wind off something alive before I will believe an instrument about it. A ribbon is a machine. Grass is a machine. Feathers are not. Maybe I stood in a hole in the air for 15 minutes and made a life out of it. But then again, maybe not. I could hear my own wristwatch standing 40 feet from a running engine. I am Warren Chastain, 1966, 29 years old, engine mechanic, night trim runs out at the far corner of the field on the Colorado Springs Plain. I have told this maybe 4 times in 60 years, and 3 of those were to my wife. A trim run is this. You have an engine, and you have a stand, and you strap the engine into the stand, and you run it up, and you set it. Fuel schedule, temperatures, the whole business. And you do it at night because the air is honest at night and because you have to run it a long time at a very high power setting, and there is no version of that which the town enjoys. Trim Pad 2 was in the far corner of the field for exactly that reason. Blast fence behind it, chain link around it. A strip of concrete with chalk marks painted on it for the stand positions. 4 light poles, and nothing else out there but prairie and the mountain sitting off to the west as a black place where there were no stars. I was good at it. I do not say that about much. I had run more of those than anybody on that shift, and I could hear a bad one before a gauge would tell you. And I am a little deaf, exactly as deaf as the job makes a man. And I have known that since I was 31. And I want that said early because it makes the rest of this harder for me to hold, not easier. People say 95% like it is nearly full power, and therefore nearly the same thing. It is not nearly the same thing. The last 5% of an engine like that is a different animal in every way that matters. And 95 is where you live if you want to set one properly and still have it in the morning. I ran a great many hours at 95 and I could tell you the note of it right now, and I have not heard it since 1971. The chalk marks on that pad were repainted every spring by whoever had annoyed somebody, and they were never quite in the same place twice, and there was an ongoing argument about that which I would say lasted 5 years and was never settled. The other thing about that corner in August is the moths. 4 pad lights out on open prairie at 6,000 feet, and every one of them had its own weather. Millers mostly. They would go around and then commit, and they made a sound on the glass, and in the ordinary run of a night you never heard one of them. I wore ear defenders that were older than my marriage and smelled like every man who had ever had them on. Doreen called them my ear muffs and thought that was very funny for about 11 years. Here is the dull thing that turned out to be the whole story. The base was running a sound survey that summer. There were noise complaints, which there always were, and somebody had decided to answer them with numbers. So we had 2 sound level meters. Same model, same shop, calibrated the same morning, with a little piston phone that clamps over the microphone and makes one exact tone, and you turn it on and the needle goes to a line, and if the needle does not go to the line, you send it back. 1 meter went on a tripod at the fence line. That was the survey meter. The other clipped to the chest of my coveralls because the survey also wanted a man position reading. What the fellow standing there is actually taking. I had worn it for 11 nights. It was, I would say, the single most boring object I have ever been responsible for. I liked the calibration, though. I want to admit that. There's a small pleasure in a needle landing exactly on a line. The other thing about a trim run is that it makes a man alone. There were 3 of us out there. At 95%, nobody talks. You cannot talk. Everything is hand signals, and you learn about 9 of them, and one of them means shut it down right now, and you learn that one first. The other two were up by the truck 140 feet off. I was 30 feet from the stand with the run card. So there is another man in your eye line, and he might as well be in another county. At 95%, that engine tears a hole in the night. You feel it in your chest as much as hear it. Your coveralls move on you. The grass out past the fence lies over. That is the ordinary condition of my life at that time, and it is what I want you standing in. The pressure went first. Not the sound, the pressure. The thing that sits on your sternum and shoves. It went out in about a second, like somebody had opened a door, and every needle on that stand was where it had been. Then the small sounds came in. I heard my boots on the concrete. I heard my coveralls. That is not a thing a man hears. I heard a moth hit the pad light 30 feet behind me, and I want you to understand what I am telling you, which is that I heard an insect hit a piece of glass 30 feet away over an engine running at 95% 40 feet in front of me. And then I heard my wristwatch. It was a bulova my wife's father gave me. I had never heard it outdoors in my life. I will tell you the one thing I actually saw, which is nothing, and that is the point. There was nothing over the pad. There was nothing on the fence. There was no light anywhere except our own 4 poles and the field beacon going around. Whatever the edge was, it had no color and no shimmer, and did not bend the light, and the only way I know it had a shape at all is that I found it with my hand, and it was in the same place every time I went looking. I put my arm out. I put it straight out in front of me, and about 18 inches from my chest, the sound closed on my hand. That is the only way I can say it. It closed on it, like putting your hand into a river, and it pushed my fingers back, and I brought it in, and it was quiet, and my hand was in the quiet with me. I did that twice, not more. I was not curious the way you think a man would be. I was standing very still. Then I looked down at the meter on my chest. The needle was near the bottom of the scale, down where you would get in an office with the door shut. I know that scale better than I know my own address, and I stood there and read it again. Now, the thing that made it worse, and I have never gotten anybody to feel this the way I feel it, there was no ringing. When a man's hearing goes, there is a ringing. When you take a bad noise, there is a ringing and a muffle, and a pressure up behind your eyes, and you swallow and it pops. There was none of that. My ears were fine. They were working perfectly. I could hear a moth. It was not that I could not hear the engine. It was that in an 18-inch space around me there was no engine to hear, and 40 feet in front of me and everywhere else in Colorado there was. I stepped backwards to get out of it. 4 steps, and the noise came over me like a door shutting the other way. All of it, brutal and enormous and completely normal, and I stood in it for a solid minute feeling wonderful about the world. I decided I had gone lightheaded. Low blood pressure, a long shift, not enough supper. I was going to eat something and be fine. Lattimore shut it down at the end of the card, and neither of those two ever looked over. They were exactly as deaf and exactly as bored as always, and one of them signed at me about coffee, and I signed back, and we put the covers on. Then I unclipped the meter and looked at the chart from the fence. The fence meter had a paper trace on it, and that trace has a flat, enormous plateau right across the whole run with no dip in it anywhere. Whatever happened to me did not happen 40 feet away. There is a piece of paper that proves it, and I held it in my hands. And my meter, the man position meter, read a level you could hold a conversation in. I took both of them to the shop in the afternoon. Farron ran the piston phone on both while I stood there. Twice, both landed on the line. He did it a third time because I asked him to and because he was a patient man, and both landed on the line, and he looked up at me with a face I remember better than I remember most of my children's birthdays, and he said, plain as anything, that they were good instruments. They stayed good. Both of them were in service for years, and I checked on that one more than once, over about a decade, in the way a man checks on a thing he would rather have been wrong about. The man position figure from that night went into the survey as a suspected instrument fault and was thrown out, and I signed the form that threw it out, which I think about. I did not tell Lattimore. I want to be honest about why, and the why is not mysterious. I was 29, and I was the best man on that shift, and I intended to stay the best man on that shift. And a fellow who says the noise went around him is a fellow they moved to the parts room. He was a friend of mine for 30 years, and I never told him, and he died in Pueblo in '94. I told Doreen about 6 weeks later in the kitchen badly. She listened all the way through, which she always did, and then she asked whether it had frightened me, and I said no, and she said that was the part she did not like. She was smarter than me by a considerable margin. Nothing came near me. Nothing wanted anything. There was no light and nothing in the sky, and I did not see one thing all night, and I have never once said that I did. But something took the noise off a man, at 18 inches, all the way around, and held it there while he stood on a piece of concrete, and gave it back to him when he stepped out of it. And it did not take it off the 2 men at the truck, and it did not take it off the fence meter, and it did not take it off the grass. You would have to know where I stopped. Right down to my fingers. I am 89. My hearing is what you would expect. But I still lift one ear cup for a second in every loud place I go. A shop, a plant, a train, my grandson's band once, which he did not care for. Just for a second. Just to check that it is all there, maybe an engine and a long shift and a tired man made all of it. And I have carried a nothing around for 60 years. But then again, maybe not. Everything in 9 miles of that country went gray, and I came out of it clean enough to eat off. Rudy Pelfrey, 44 years old in the spring of 1998, walking survey transects on the maneuver ground down in the southeast corner of Colorado, where the plain runs out to Rimrock and the canyons cut back into it, and there is nothing else at all. The job, if you have not met it, is that before the Army moves a great deal of heavy equipment across a piece of ground, somebody walks that ground and writes down what is on it. Hearths, scatters. Old rock art up under the rims. Homestead trash, which I love and nobody else does. I am an archaeologist by training and a monitor by paycheck, and I took the contract because it kept me in the field, and I have made my peace with the paperwork the way you make peace with weather. 20 years of it. I have been caught out in dust down there 4 separate times, and I know exactly what it does to a man. It gets in your teeth first. Then the corners of your eyes, and the corners of your mouth, and inside your ears, and then you spend 2 days blowing your nose black, and everybody makes the same joke. Let me set the ground properly, because it is worth it. Short grass, yucca, cholla, and rimrock going gold at the edges. Grasshoppers coming up off the grass like sparks off a grinder, hundreds a minute, and the noise of them is the whole sound of that country in May. The heat comes up through your boot soles, not down from the sky. You can see 30 miles on a normal day, and there is nothing in 30 miles but more of it. I carried a 2-quart canteen I froze overnight, and it lasted until about 2 in the afternoon, and then I was rationing. Sound does an odd thing at the base of a rim down there. It comes back at you a beat late and slightly to one side, so that for your first week you keep turning around. After that, you stop hearing it, and then one day, years later, somebody new turns around and you remember. Transects put one person on a line, and the next person 800 meters away over a rise, which on that ground is out of sight and well out of shouting. The radio worked when the terrain allowed, and the terrain almost never allowed. That is not a complaint. That is a description of a good day. The spacing is not arbitrary, and people always think it is. You walk lines close enough together that a person of ordinary eyesight moving at a normal pace will not miss a scatter, and no closer, because every extra meter of overlap is a day of somebody's life. 800 meters was generous for that ground, because that ground is bare. On brush you go tighter. I will tell you one thing that will make me sound like a difficult man. A chip is not a flake. A flake has a bulb and a platform, and it came off a core because a human being made it come off a core. And a chip is a piece of rock that fell off another piece of rock. And the difference is the difference between an artifact and a rock. And I have corrected people about it at parties, which is one of several reasons I am not invited to many. I do not have a bad word to say about the Army on that ground, and people want me to. They ran the survey. They paid for the survey. They moved the survey up when we asked. What tracked equipment does to a hearth is what tracked equipment does to a hearth, and everybody involved knew it, and the whole point of me being out there on a Tuesday in May was that somebody had decided to know where the hearths were first. I have worked for worse. There was a graduate student that spring, Katchen, who lasted 8 days. On the last one, she sat down on a rim and said she could not stand how big it was, not the heat, the size. I have never forgotten that because I knew exactly what she meant, and I had thought I was the only one. Now the dull thing, which is the flagging ribbon. I tie a strip of surveyor's flagging through my belt loop every morning, a different color every survey day, and I leave it hanging. The reason is photographs. When you shoot a find, the day's color's in the frame, and later, when you are putting 140 photographs in order in a motel room in Trinidad, the color tells you the day. It is a small system, and I did not invent it, and it works. I tie it with a twist so it does not tangle in the sage. That is the detail. Remember the twist. That day was 91 degrees at 11 in the morning and clear to the horizon in every direction. And southwest of me a wall came up off the ground. Not weather, that is the first thing. There was no cell, no anvil, no front, no green under a cloud, no smell of rain from 40 miles off, which is a real thing down there and one of the great pleasures of my life. Just a brown wall about as tall as a grain elevator coming across the plain, and I could see the shadow of it moving on the ground ahead of it. I did what you do, which is turn my back to it, put my hat on backwards, get the bandana over my face, and squat down. The grasshoppers stopped. Not all of them, the ones near me. There was a ring of silence on that ground maybe 8 or 10 feet across with me in the middle of it, and outside of it the noise going on exactly as it had, that whole dry, sizzling racket unchanged. And that is the first time I felt anything other than mild professional annoyance. Then the wall got to me. 30 miles of visibility went to about 6 feet in under a minute. It sounded like rain on a roof. I have never heard dust make that sound before or since, and I have thought about it, and I believe what I was hearing was the grass, which was taking all of it, and which was 8 inches away. And I could see my hands. I want to be very careful. I could see my hands perfectly. I could see the weave of my sleeves and the stitching on my cuffs. I could see the toes of my boots on clean rock, and 4 inches out from all of it the world had stopped existing. I stood up. I do not know why I stood up. There was a thing 4 inches from my face that had taken the sun off the sky, and I stood up into it like a man getting up to answer a door. Nothing. No grit, not in my teeth, not in my eyes, and my eyes were open, and I held them open, which is the least sensible thing I have ever done outdoors. I licked my lips deliberately in the middle of it because I wanted very badly to be wrong. They were clean, so I walked. 100 paces counting, which I do because my knee will not take a measuring wheel anymore. Right through it. and the clean went with me at 4 inches, all the way around, and it went around my hat and my canteen and the pack on my back, and I stepped over a sage bush that was already the color of a sidewalk and came out the other side with the grass on my boots still green. Then it went past me, the way those things do, and the light came back the color of a bruise, and then the color of an ordinary afternoon, and I felt wonderful. I want that in there. I stood on that plane, absolutely flooded with relief, and I explained the whole thing to myself in about 11 seconds. I had been at the base of the rim rock, and the rim rock had made an eddy, and the geometry had held the dust off me, and this was interesting, and I would mention it to somebody. Then I walked back to look at the geometry, which took me 9 minutes, and the geometry does not do that. The rim there is 160 meters off and it runs the wrong way, and I had walked 100 paces out from under it in a straight line, and I know because I counted them. At the assembly area, everybody was gray to the eyebrows. Alvarado had a clean stripe across his face where his sunglasses had been, and everybody was laughing about it and hawking and spitting and pouring water over their heads. Nobody said a word about me. I have thought about that more than almost anything else. It was not that they were being polite. It is that nobody looked. And I have decided, over a very long time, that I was lucky, because I do not know what that afternoon would have turned into if one of them had looked properly at a man who had walked out of that with dry eyes. I sat in the truck at the end of that day with the door open and my boots in the dirt, and I went through it in order, out loud, the way you do a data sheet. Wall came from the southwest. Grasshoppers quit at 8 to 10 feet. Visibility to 6 feet. Boundary at 4 inches. Duration, call it 4 minutes. 100 paces walked inside it. And then I got to the column where a person is supposed to write what the thing was, and I sat there with a pencil in my hand for a while, and then I put the pencil down, and that is the only time in 20 years I have failed to fill in a form. The ribbon is the thing. That strip of flagging had been hanging against my leg all morning. It was gray with dust on the side away from me and clean on the side toward me, which is what you would expect and which is not what I am telling you. The dividing line was not at the cloth. It was a hand's width out from me in the air, and it ran dead straight, and the ribbon has a twist in it, so the line crosses the twist, which means the same inch of cloth is filthy on one turn and clean on the next, and then filthy again, and the boundary between them is a plane that has nothing to do with the ribbon at all. It has to do with where I was. I have that ribbon. It is in a plastic bag in a drawer in Pueblo, and it has been there 28 years, and it has never shed a grain. The truck's air filter, 4 hours old, came out packed solid enough to stand a pencil in. My handkerchief, which never left my pocket, was clean, which proves nothing, and I mention it because it is the sort of thing I checked at 2 in the morning that night. Nothing touched me, nothing chased me. Nothing was in that dust, and I never saw one thing, and I have never claimed I did. Something came across that plane and coated a couple of 100 square miles of Colorado and left one man out of it at 4 inches and moved the 4 inches along with him for 100 paces and got it right around a hat brim and a canteen and the twist in a piece of ribbon. That is not weather. Weather does not know where a man's hat ends. I still check the wind side of my own clothes at the end of a day, every day, 28 years. And if it is even, if the dust on me is the same on both sides, I stand there a minute longer than I need to. Maybe I got lucky in an eddy I have failed to find on a map. But then again, maybe not. The frost came across that wing toward my hands and then it stopped and went around, and I watched it do it. My name is Opal. Opal Renfro then, and I am 104 now. And in December of 1943 I was 22 years old, and I was an aircraft engine mechanic on the night line at the training field on the Arkansas River, down in southeastern Colorado. There was a war on, and what that meant for a girl from Arkansas who had been raised around a shop was that a man came through Fort Smith looking for anybody who could hold a wrench, and I went, and that is the whole story of how I got there. My mother wrote me twice a week, and it was mostly about my sister's wedding. The field had twin-engine trainers on it, rows of them, and the whole business of the place was turning out crews. They flew days and they flew nights, and the airplanes came back needing things, and the night line was the four of us who saw to it that in the morning there were airplanes. I want to explain the frostboard, because the frostboard is why I was where I was. At that field, in that valley, in December, frost is not a nuisance. Frost is the schedule. An airplane frosted hard is an airplane that does not fly, and a wing with frost on it is a wing that does not lift. And every morning the field wanted to know one number: when. So the line shack kept a board on the wall. Frost time, first flyable, who scraped what, initialed. It was a piece of plywood with a grease pencil on a string, and it was the most important object on that base, and I mean that seriously. There is a right way to scrape a canopy and a wrong way, and the wrong way is anything with a hurry in it. You take the edge off first, at the corner, and you let the plastic tell you when it is ready to let go, and if you force it, you leave a scratch, and a cadet spends 11 weeks looking through your scratch. I taught that to 4 different girls, and every one of them wanted to go faster. We had a stove in the line shack with a pot on it that was never washed in the entire history of the war, and there was always something burning on the flat of it, and the smell of that shack is the smell I would pick if I could only keep one. Bernice Ottman was on that line with me. She was from Trinidad, up the road, and she cried exactly once in October about something at home, and not one person on that field ever teased her about it, which is the thing I would tell you about those men if you only let me tell you one thing. They issued me a coat that was a man's coat and would have fit 2 of me, and I cut it down myself on a Sunday and did a bad job of the shoulders and wore it for 2 more winters, and I have it yet. That night was 12 degrees and dead clear, and the frost was coming down hard. You can hear it if it is quiet. It sounds like somebody straightening tissue paper in the next room. And the aeroplanes tick as they shrink, all down the line, one and then another, like a house settling. I have a scar on the inside of my left wrist from a drop-light cage, from my second week, from grabbing one the way you grab a thing you have not respected yet. It is a little ladder of white marks, and it has been on me for 83 years, and every time I see it, I am 22. I was on the wing of number 19 with a drop light hooked over the Pitot mast, working a cowl fastener that had been cross-threaded by somebody who ought to have known better. On my knees, on the skin, in coveralls 3 sizes too big for me that I had taken in myself twice, and I had my coffee on the concrete beside my knee. Off the line shack stove in a can, because that is what we drank out of, and I set it down beside me the way I had every night for 10 months. Now, about being alone. There were 4 of us across a mile of parking apron, and I had the far end. The line shack was 800 feet away, and there was a war on, and nobody was coming to check on anybody. That is not a complaint either. I liked it. It was the first time in my life nobody had known exactly where I was, and I want to say plainly, I have scraped more frost off more glass than anybody who was ever on that field. I know what frost does and how fast it does it and what it looks like coming and going. That is not a small claim, and it is the claim the whole thing rests on. The ticking stopped. Not everywhere. Down the line, at 14 and 15 and 16, they were still going, ticking away in the cold. The 3 or 4 nearest me went quiet. Then the frost came across the wing, not settling out of the air, coming across. From the tip in toward the root, a gray advancing over the aluminium, an edge to it, moving about as fast as you would push a broom. I sat back on my heels and watched it come with a fastener in one hand, and I would like to tell you, I thought something intelligent, and what I actually thought was that I had never seen it do that, which is not a thought, it is a sentence. It reached my knees and it opened. It went around both knees and closed behind me and kept on going toward the root, and there I was kneeling on a clean footprint of bare aluminium in a wing that had gone white from tip to fuselage. I put my left hand down, flat on the skin, out to the side, and the clean was already there under it. So I picked my hand up and set it down 8 inches over. The clean went with it. 1 finger's width all around exactly, and the place my hand had been frosted over in about 4 seconds while I watched it happen. I did that 3 or 4 times. On the wing of a training airplane at 1 o'clock in the morning in the middle of a war, I sat and played that game with my own hand like a child at a window. And I was not afraid. I want to be clear about that. I was 22, and I was interested. The thing that finally got me was my breath. I was breathing hard because it was 12 degrees and because I had been fighting that fastener for 20 minutes. And there was no plume. Nothing in front of my face, not once, the whole time it was happening. And every other soul on that field that night was walking around inside their own little weather. Chief Nesmith came down the line at about 1. He walked right past 19. He looked at the wing, which was white, and at me, which was on it, and he said the board was going to be ugly in the morning, and he kept walking. I have gone back and forth my whole life about whether he saw the bare patch under me. I do not think he did. I think a man walking a mile of frosted airplanes at 1 in the morning sees frost. Then it quit. I felt the cold come back and get on my face all at once, and it was so ordinary and so unpleasant that I laughed out loud, alone, on a wing, at 1 in the morning. And I decided the droplight had been warming the skin. That is what I decided. The droplight had been warming the skin and heat rises, and the whole thing was nothing at all. I believed that for about 40 minutes. It is a bad theory. A droplight hooked on a pitot mast 6 feet away does not warm a wing. And it certainly does not warm a wing in the shape of a person's 2 knees, and it does not move when a hand moves. I finished at 2:30 and reached down for my coffee. The can beside my knee was frozen. Solid all the way through. A brown plug I had to knock out on a tire. That can had been sitting about a foot outside the clean. The one I had been holding, the one that had been in my lap and then in the crook of my arm for an hour and a half, was hot. Not warm, pouring temperature. It was pouring temperature at 3 in the morning when I got to the shack, and it was pouring temperature when I got to the barracks at 4, and I drank it sitting on the end of my cot in the dark, and it was hot, and I have never told that part to more than about 6 people, because that is the part that makes them look at you. I sat on that cot with the can in both hands, and I did the arithmetic that anybody would do. The can in my lap was closer to my body, so it stayed warm. Except that a tin can of coffee in a 12-degree night goes cold in 20 minutes, whether it is in your lap or on the moon, and I had been out there 90, and the other can, which was 1 foot further away and had started out exactly as hot, was a solid plug. 1 foot. That is the whole distance in that story. Everything on one side of a line a foot from my knee did what December does, and everything on the other side of it did not, and the line was in the open air, and it went where I went. The morning board had 19 aeroplanes frosted hard, and nothing flyable until 9. And out on the wing of number 19, there was a bare patch in the shape of a person kneeling. The crew chief wrote it up as a fuel spill. Nobody repainted anything. Nobody said 1 word to me, and I did not raise my hand. I will tell you what the edge looked like, since it is the only thing there was to look at. It had no thickness and no color. It was not a rim, and it was not wet, and there was no line of heavier frost piled against it the way you would get if something had pushed it. It was simply where the gray stopped, 1 finger's width out, holding that width around a knee and around the side of a hand and around the knuckles, which are a complicated shape, without getting the distance wrong anywhere. I stayed on that field until the spring of '45, and I stood out on the apron a good many mornings and watched 20 engines start in sequence down the line, which is a sound I have never been able to describe and have never stopped trying to. And nothing like that night ever happened again to me or, as far as I ever heard, to anybody. There was nothing in the sky. There was no light, no sound, no shape. Nothing came near me, and nothing wanted anything, and I never once felt in any danger, and I have had 82 years to change my mind about that, and I have not. But something laid frost on every square inch of a mile of aeroplanes and left 2 knees and 1 hand out of it, and moved the hand when I moved it, and put the frost back in 4 seconds when I took it away. To do that, you have to be watching a girl's hands, very closely, the whole time. I am 104. I pour my coffee into a cup now, never a can, and I set it down away from myself, over on the far side of the table, and my great-granddaughter thinks that is because I spill, and I let her think it. Maybe an old woman built all that out of a droplight and a cold night. But then again, maybe not. 5 people standing on that apron had their hair straight up off their heads, and mine was lying flat. Yvonne Castleberry. I was 39. I was a firefighter and engineer at a station on the post at the foot of the range south of Colorado Springs. And this was July of 2003, and I have told it maybe a dozen times, and I have never once pushed it on anybody. A post fire station is a fire station. That is the first thing people get wrong. We ran medicals and kitchen fires and car wrecks on the highway, and grass fires in the training areas, and the rest of the time we cleaned things and waited, exactly like every other station in America. The uniform is different, and the paperwork is worse, and that is the extent of it. The bay smells like diesel and floor wax and coffee and a little smoke that never comes out of gear no matter what you do to it. We had a dog for a while named Shep, who belonged to nobody and slept under the bench and went out of his mind in storms, which is going to matter to me later, though not in the way you think. 2 dull things. The first is the pager rack. Every pager on shift goes on the charging rack by the door at the start of the tour. That is the rule, and it is a good rule, and everybody follows it. Except me. I carried mine on my belt on the charger clip, and it came off the rack the second I walked in, and I took a truly enormous amount of grief for it for 7 straight years. There is a reason, and it is short, and I am only going to say it once. In '96, I missed a call because my pager was on a rack across a room. That is all. Nobody died. It was not a story. It was just a thing I never wanted again. The second is the tone alert test at 8 every night. It squawks. Everybody groans. Somebody says something about it, and that is how you know the evening has started. I should say what 20 years does to a person on that job, because it is relevant. It makes you extremely boring about weather. I have stood on that apron in storms 100 times. I have had my arm hair go up on me before, plenty, and I know exactly what it feels like. A crawl, like a sunburn deciding something, and I know exactly what you do about it, which is go inside and stop being the tallest thing. The pulling of the trash cans is mine, and it has always been mine. Somebody left one out in '99 and we chased it across 2 parking lots at 11 at night, and I have never trusted anybody else with it since. It is the kind of small, stupid ownership you develop on a shift schedule. Now, that country gets dry lightning off the range in July. It comes up the front of the mountains in the afternoon, and by dark it is walking north along the range, putting down strikes with nothing under it. No rain, not a drop. It is the most beautiful and most infuriating weather in the American West, and every fire department within 100 miles hates it personally. Everybody watches. That is what I want you to see. 6 of us, out on the apron at about 10 at night with coffee, watching blue-white go off behind the mountain and counting. Because everybody counts, you cannot help it. I had gone down to the far end to pull the trash cans in before the wind got them, which put me about 40 feet from the rest of them. That is the sort of ordinary chore that puts a person by themselves at exactly the wrong moment, and I have thought about that a great deal. The reels started first. Every hose reel in the bay behind me began ticking at the same time. If you have not heard it, it is a small metallic tick, and it is the reel taking a charge, and it is the sound that tells a firefighter to get inside. And the aerials on the trucks were humming, and Rooker, our captain, said out loud, "Oh, that is close." I turned around, and all 5 of them had their hair standing straight up off their scalps. Straight up. Every one. Tavis was a probationary that year, and terrified of lightning and hiding it badly, and his hair was the worst of them, and they were all laughing and taking pictures of each other on a little flip phone. And my hair was down. I put my hand up to it, flat, lying on my shoulders exactly as it had all evening. I looked at my forearms, and the hair on them was lying smooth. I took my ball cap off, which is the surest test there is, because a cap holds it down and then it comes up when you lift it, and there was nothing. No lift, no crawl, not a thing. In air that was visibly, audibly full of it, in air that was ticking. So I reached out toward them. About a foot from my body, the hair on my forearm stood up, right at the wrist. I pulled my arm back in and it lay down. Out, up, in, down. I did that 4 times and then I stopped doing it, and I want to say something about why I stopped. Which is that the 4th time I understood that I was not testing the air. I was tracing an edge. Something out there had a shape, and I was finding it with my own arm the way you find a wall in a dark room. And I did not want to know any more about it than I already did. And I will tell you what there was to look at, which was nothing. The edge had no glow to it and no shimmer, and did not bend the light off the bay doors. There was no smell to it, no ozone right there, though the whole rest of that apron reeked of it. The only way I know it was there at all is that my own arm found it, and it was in the same place every single time, and it held that place around a shoulder, and around the top of my head, which I checked by standing on my toes, like an idiot, and feeling the air take hold about a foot up. The mountain does a thing with a storm that I have never seen anywhere else. It eats it. The whole cell goes in behind the ridge, and there is nothing for a minute and a half, and then it comes back out the north side rearranged, bigger and closer, and everybody on the apron makes the same noise. That happened twice that night. Nobody was watching me, except that one of them was. Rooker looked straight at my flat hair, in the middle of all of it, for about 2 seconds, and he did not say anything. And he never said anything, not that night, not in the 11 years we worked together after. And he retired to Arizona, and we exchanged Christmas cards until he died, and it never came up once. I have decided that was a kindness. Most days. There was no rain, not one drop, all night, and the count I have from the paperwork afterward is more than 60 strikes in about 2 hours. And there was no thunder that anybody flinched at. And the flinch is the thing you notice missing, because on that apron in a storm, somebody always flinches and everybody always laughs at them. Then the storm walked north. The reels went quiet. Everybody's hair came down, somebody made coffee. And I stood there for a good minute and built myself a theory, and it was a decent theory. The apron slopes toward the drains. I was standing on the low end. I was grounded through the concrete and they were not, and that was the whole difference. I liked that theory. I kept it for about 90 minutes. At 11:40, a strike took the tower. Everything on the charging rack was dead. Not reset. Dead. 4 pagers with the plastic bubbled at the clip, and one of them fused to the cradle. The tone alert, gone. Both bay door openers, gone. The coffee maker, the television, and a radio somebody's wife had given him. Mine was on my belt, mine was fine. It was on, it had a full charge, and it worked for 4 more years. So did my watch. So did the flashlight in my pocket, and the little pen light, and the phone in my locker, which was inside a locker inside a wall, and I have never been able to decide what to do with that last one. 6 feet. That is the distance between the charging rack by the door and where I hang my coat. 6 feet, and everything on one side of it is scrap, and everything on the other side of it is fine, and the only difference is which side of it I had been on. Shep, the dog, slept through the whole thing under the bench, which everybody remarked on for weeks because that dog normally spent a storm in the shower room shaking. That is the only other thing about that night I have never been able to put anywhere. And in the morning there was a stand of scrub oak up the hill that had taken one, and it smelled the way that smells, which is like a struck match the size of a house. And Tavis and I walked up and looked at it, and neither of us said anything the whole way there or the whole way back. Nobody can find those flip phone pictures. I have asked. 3 of the 5 are still alive, and 2 of them remember taking them, and none of them has the phone or the pictures or any idea what happened to either, and that is not sinister. That is 2003. The insurance man wrote the 6 feet down, then he asked me to say it again, and he wrote it down again, and he looked at the rack and looked at the wall and did not ask a 3rd time. Nothing came near me. Nothing threatened anybody. Nobody was hurt, the dog was fine, Tavis was fine, and there was not one thing in that sky except weather. And I've never said otherwise, and I'm not saying otherwise now. But 60-odd strikes came down that night, and something put a charge into every reel, every aerial, every hair on 5 people's heads, and every piece of electronics in that station, and left one person out of it at about a foot all the way around for 2 hours while she moved, and left out her watch and her flashlight and a pager on her hip that was 6 feet from 4 pagers that burned. That is not weather being random. Random does not stop at a woman's wrist and stay there. Tavis asked me, about a year later, on a long drive back from a mutual aid call, whether anything strange had ever happened to me on the job. He asked it the way people ask it, half joking, ready to laugh. And I said no. I have never been sorry about very much, and I am a little sorry about that. I am in my 60s. I racked my pager the next tour, and I have racked it every tour since, and I never carried it on my belt again. Not one time. And when the new people ask why, I tell them it is the rule. Maybe I stood on the low end of a slab and got lucky twice in one night. But then again, maybe not. The bugs opened up in front of me and closed up behind me and did that all night long. Virgil Trask, 25 years old, July of 1961, night watchman for the general contractor on a construction site out on the eastern Colorado plains. And I would like to say at the front that I was an idiot at 25, and this story is partly about that. They were putting something hard in the ground out there. That is as much as I ever knew, and as much as I ever wanted to know. There was a hole, and the hole was big enough that walking around the edge of it took me a little under 6 minutes, and there was a batch plant and a spoil pile and a trailer and a chain-link fence around the whole business, and 11 miles of gravel to the nearest farmhouse. My job was to be there. That was it. Walk the fence, look at the equipment, do not let the fuel walk off. 4 months of it by that July, and the total inventory of things that had ever happened was 1 coyote and 1 flat tire. They had 4 portable light stands, each one on its own little generator set at the corners of the work, and a light stand on the prairie in July has its own weather. Millers mostly, and June bugs, and moths the size of a child's hand, and they come at that reflector all night and hit it, and it makes a sound like sleet. If you have never stood under one, you would not believe how much of it there is. You could hear a light stand from 300 yards by the bugs alone. 2 things I did every night. I set my lunch pail on the transformer box under stand 1. Same box, same spot, 4 months. And I walked the 4 stands on a pocket watch. My uncle's watch, which ran about 2 minutes fast, and which I never had fixed because I liked being early. 22 minutes a lap. That was the figure, and I held it close, and I was proud of holding it close, and I would like you to know that a 25-year-old man walking a fence in the dark for 4 months will find something to be proud of, or he will lose his mind. Nobody else was out there. There was a telephone in the trailer at the far end, and no other telephone for 11 miles, and the gate was chained, and I had the only key on that shift. Mr. Yost, the foreman, called everybody chief because he could not hold a name in his head, and Mr. Yost went home at 6 like a sensible man. I was writing to a girl in Sterling named Alberta, and she thought the job was ridiculous, and she was correct. She wanted to know what I did all night, and there was no answer that did not sound like nothing, so I made things up, mildly, the way you do at that age, and none of the things I made up were half as strange as the one thing that actually happened, and I never wrote to her about it, and we were married 4 years later, and I never told her either. The prairie in July at night out there is warm and enormous, and it smells like dust and diesel, and somebody's cut alfalfa from a long way off. There is nothing to look at except the 4 stands and the stars, and after 4 months of that, a man gets a very odd relationship with the sky, which is that he stops noticing it entirely. The batch plant made a sound cooling down at night, a slow, irregular ticking that went on for hours after everybody left, and I timed my first lap by it for a while until I got the watch. The generator on stand 2 ran rough all summer, and there was a whole political situation about whose job it was to fix it, and it never did get fixed. And I mention that only so you understand what the important business of that site was, at my level, on an ordinary night. June bugs specifically. I want to talk about June bugs for a second. They are heavy, and they are stupid, and they hit a hard hat like somebody flicking it with a fingernail. And you can be standing there having a perfectly good night, and one of them will get you on the ear, and you will say something you would not want your mother to hear. That is the baseline. That is every night from June to September on that job. So, that night, I came around towards stand 3 on my 3rd lap, about 1:15 midnight, and the sound was wrong. Stand 3 had gone quiet, not the generator. The generator was running, and I know its note, because they all have a note, and they change it when they are low on fuel. The bugs. Stand 3 had stopped sounding like sleet, and when I got up close I could see them. The whole beam was still boiling with them, as thick as ever, going around and around in that cone of light the way they do. They just were not hitting it. Then I walked into the light, and the whole mass of them opened up in front of me. Not scattered. Nothing like scattered. Scattering is a thing bugs do, and it looks like an explosion, and it is over in a second, and then they come back. This opened, smooth, the way a curtain goes back, and it stayed open in front of me while I walked, and it closed behind me at about 6 feet. I stood in the middle of it. I was not frightened. I want that on the record because I have found that people expect fear, and there was not any. And I've decided since that a great deal of what protected me that night was being 25. I looked over at stand 1, 60 feet away, and my lunch pail on the transformer box was black with them. The lid, the handle, the concrete around it, crawling. And I was standing in a beam with 1,000 of them in it, and not one on me. So I tested it, because I was 25. I put my arms straight out and I stood dead still under stand 3 for what turned out to be 11 minutes by the watch, and I did not have one thing land on me. Not one. And the whole time I could hear them hitting the reflector 11 feet above my head, which is the detail I always give people, because it means the exemption did not go all the way up. It went up about as far as I did. Here is what got me eventually, and it took a while because I am slow. I get bitten, I am one of those people. I had been eaten alive on that site every single night since May, and there was a bottle of something pink in the trailer with my name on it in grease pencil. I was not bitten once that night. Not one bite. And the next night I was again. And the night after that. And I have been bitten every summer of my life since. About 2 a.m, I got it worked out. They had put a new bulb in stand 3 that week. Some different color of light. The bugs did not care for it, and they were going around it, and I'd happened to be inside that when I walked up. That was my explanation, and I was so pleased with it that I ate my sandwich standing right under stand 3, feeling like the smartest man in Washington County. Then I looked down at the concrete. At first light, I walked it. All of it. And this is the part I have never gotten out of my head in 65 years. Under those 4 stands, the dead bugs were lying about an inch deep. That is normal in July out there. You get a drift of them by morning and somebody sweeps it. Running through all of it was a clean path of bare concrete, about 12 feet wide, with a little raised rim on both sides where the drift had piled against nothing. And it traced every step I had taken. It went where I went. It curved where I curved. It had a wide place where I had stopped by the compressor, and it had a circle in it under stand 3 where I had stood still with my arms out. And it had 4 feet of it at the north corner where I had walked backwards to look at something. And you could see that too, because the path got wider and then narrowed and then went on the way I had come. There were no tracks in it. Not mine, not anybody's. An inch of dead insects all around it, and a clean floor down the middle of it, and not one footprint anywhere on the clean. And the concrete inside the path was cool. 6 a.m. in July, on a slab that had been under 1,000 watts all night. And the bare part was cool to my hand, and the part under the drift was warm. I walked the whole path twice before anybody got there, once out and once back, and the second time I did it slowly with the watch in my hand, because I wanted to know how long ago I had made each part of it, and the answer is that I could tell. I could stand at the wide place and say, that was about 12:30. I could stand at the circle and say that was the 11 minutes. There was a record of my night lying on that slab in dead insects, and I was the only person in the world who could read it. And I read all of it in the gray light by myself, and then I went and sat in the truck. The concrete inside the clean is the thing I would want somebody to explain, not the bugs. Bugs are bugs, and maybe there is a reason. But a slab under a light stand takes the heat all night and gives it back at dawn, and it does that everywhere, evenly, and there is no way for a strip of it 12 feet wide to be cool. I put both hands flat on it and moved along and found the line with my palms, and the line was sharp. An inch either side of it, and the difference was plain. The day watchman came on at 7 and found the drift, and complained about having to sweep it for a solid 10 minutes. He never said one word about the shape of it. He swept the whole thing into the pile, and that was the end of the only piece of evidence I ever had. I did not point it out. I was 25, and Mr. Yost was standing right there, and I wanted my job. Nothing came near me. Nothing landed on me. There was no light in the sky except our own 4 stands, and nothing wanted anything from me at all. And I have never once said I saw a thing, because I did not. But something kept every insect on that prairie off one man for a whole night, at 6 feet, all the way around, and moved the 6 feet with him for 4 laps of a fence, and got it right around a stop and a turn, and 4 feet walked backwards. To do that, you would have to know where he was, continuously, all night, down to which direction he was facing. I am 90. I still leave a light on outside my house, and every night before I go to bed I go out and I stand under it a minute and I look at what is under it. My daughter thinks I am checking for the mail. Maybe a fellow with a bad bulb and a big opinion of himself built the rest of it out of one strange night. But then again, maybe not. The light lay on all 60 of them and it would not come near me, and I have never once thought it was unkind. Selma Talent. In February of 1955, I was 29, and I was the night nurse on a long-stay ward on the 3rd floor of the Army Hospital in Aurora, and this is the smallest story I have, and it is the one I think about. You would have to have been on a ward like that to know what they were. 60 beds in one long room, 4 rows, iron legs, tall windows down both sides with the blackout hardware still bolted on 10 years after anybody needed it. Men who had been there months and some of them years. Not sick in the way that makes a ward busy. Sick in the way that makes a ward quiet and long and full of habits. Floor wax and carbolic and 60 men sleeping, which is a smell, and it is not unpleasant, only particular. And I could pick it out today. I had one shoe that squeaked. I never fixed it. I have thought about why, and the reason is that they liked it. A man, half asleep at 3 a.m, hears the squeak coming up the aisle and knows the world is still being run by somebody, and he goes back down, and that is worth more than a person who has not done that work would believe. Here is my one piece of procedure, and then I will get on with it. At 4 o'clock, I stood in the doorway before I walked the aisle, and I counted sleepers by their breathing. Not by looking, by listening. 60 men breathing out of phase is a sound like a tide, and if you stand in it long enough you can hear the shape of it, and you can hear when one of them is not in it. A man who has stopped breathing right is the only emergency the dark ever gives you any warning about. And the warning is small, and you have to be standing still to get it. My mother had one opinion about night work, which she gave me the week I started and never repeated, and it was that a woman who works nights will be tired for the rest of her life. She was right, and I was, and I would do it again tomorrow. Miss Aiken called the kettle the sergeant, because it was loud and it had opinions, and at 4:30 every morning of 1955, the sergeant would go off in the little pantry, and the 2 of us would have tea standing up, and I have not had a cup of tea standing up in a long time, and I would like one. The other thing about that room, and I have never met anybody else who knows it, is the color of Denver snowlight on a ceiling at 5 a.m. There is a great deal of city out there, and it throws up onto the cloud, and the cloud puts it back down. And a ward with snow on the ground outside is never fully dark, and the ceiling goes a sort of pale nothing, a gray with a little warm in it. I looked at that ceiling for 4 years. I would know it anywhere. I was alone up there. Miss Aiken was my aide, and she was off the floor at the linen chute at that hour, and the rest of the hospital was asleep, and I have never in my life wanted company on that shift. 4 years on that ward. In 4 years, it had never once been entirely quiet, because with 60 men it cannot be. Somebody is always awake. Mr. Cordell in bed 41 read westerns until 2 and would not sleep, and everybody knew it. That night it went all the way quiet. I noticed it from the doorway before I noticed anything else. 60 men asleep at once, which had not happened in 4 years, and every one of them breathing slow and even and deep, all of it running together into one sound instead of 60. And then the light came up. There was no source to it. I want to be careful, because that is the sort of thing people say. I mean that I looked. The corridor door was shut, the lamps were off, there was nothing at the windows, no headlights on the drive, no moon that night. It came up in the room the way water comes into a boat, evenly, from nowhere in particular, and it was the color of the inside of a lampshade. And it lay on everything. On the counterpanes, on the floor, on the iron of the bed legs and the water glasses on the stands and the men's faces, on every one of the 60 of them, in a soft, even coat the way snowlight lies on a ceiling. And it was not on me. I stood in the middle of the aisle in a small round dark, about 3 feet across, in a lit room. That is the whole event. That is all that happened. I put my hand out. The light came onto my fingertips and stopped at my wrist. I turned my hand over and it did the same on the back of it. I moved 4 steps up the aisle and the dark came with me, exactly, and the floor behind me filled in. And there were no shadows. 60 beds, 4 rows of iron legs, 60 men, and not one shadow anywhere in that room, including under me. I was not frightened. I want to say that clearly, and I will say it again in a minute because nobody believes it the first time. I was not frightened at any point. I did not think about the door. I did not think about the bell. I stood in the middle of my own ward at 4 in the morning inside a little piece of dark, and what I felt, and I am ashamed of it and I am going to tell you anyway, was left out. That is the truth of it. 60 men were being given something and I was standing 3 feet outside of it. Miss Aiken came up from the chute at 20 past and said it was a good night and put the kettle on, and by then the light was gone and I did not say one word to her about it, then or ever. They slept until 6. Every one of them. Mr. Cordell slept until 6, and he had not slept a whole night in a year and a half. And there was another man at the far end who had not either, and he did too. And in the morning they were better. I do not mean cheerful, although they were that. I mean better, in the way that gets written down, and it was written down and nobody could account for it. And the ward went on to have the best week that February it had seen since I came onto it. I was not frightened. There, I have said it the second time. I have told this to perhaps 4 people in my life, and every one of them has waited for the part where I am afraid, and there is no such part. And when they understand that there is no such part, they lose interest, and I have always been glad to let them. I have had 70 years with this, and I have got exactly one thing out of it, and it took me until I was about 60 to get it. Somebody had to be awake, that is all. You cannot put a whole ward down for the night and leave nobody at the door. If that light had come onto me the way it came onto them, I would have been asleep on the floor of an aisle with 60 men in my care. So, it did not come onto me. It went around me at 3 feet, and it kept going around me while I walked, and it gave every one of those men the best night any of them had known in a year, and it left me out on purpose so that there would still be a nurse. I do not know what it was. I have never known. I have never said the word for it out loud because I do not have a word for it, and I would rather not borrow one. But I know what it did. It counted the room. It found the one person in it who had a job, and it left her alone. There was nothing to keep. No mark, no object, no burn, no record, but the sleep record, which is only a nurse's handwriting in a book that was thrown out in the 70s. I have nothing to show anybody, and I never have had. I worked another 31 years, and I always took nights. I took the shift nobody wanted, all the way to the end of it, and every hospital I ever worked in thought that was very good of me, and none of them ever asked. And I still do not sleep well at night, and I never have since, and I have never minded that either, because I know what a room sounds like when everybody in it is safe. I heard it once, all the way, 60 at a time, and I was standing 3 feet outside of it in the dark, holding a chart, and I would not trade it, and I would not want it any other way. I am 99. I go to bed at 11, and I lie there. The house is quiet, and my daughter's asleep down the hall, and the street is asleep, and the town is asleep, and I lie in the dark, and I listen to one person breathing instead of 60. and it is a smaller sound, and it is the same sound. And I keep my hands outside the blanket, which is a habit from the ward, and I look at the ceiling, and I wait. Maybe an old woman built all of that out of a quiet hour and a trick of a window, but then again, maybe not.